Annelle Sheline is a former employee at the US State Department who resigned in protest over US support for the Gaza war. She's currently a research fellow at the Quincy Institute. She's an astute thinker and communicator. I originally got her on the first show we did after Trump and Israel launched their illegal war on Iran. And I caught up with her again on day 16 of the war for an update on how she's assessing what's happened since then. I started our conversation by asking whether she's been surprised by anything that's happened since we last spoke.
On the one hand, no one should have been surprised by the way this has played out. I think what's surprising is that we had a president and a US administration that did not seem to understand the fact that these outcomes were entirely foreseeable. So just knowing that he launched this war on Iran apparently and has said himself that he was surprised that U.S. Arab partners, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, were angry at him for this. This is destroying their economies. That somehow he hadn't been briefed on the fact that that is obviously how they would feel. The impact this would have on the price of oil, subsequently the price of gasoline, the price of natural gas. All of these were completely foreseeable. In addition, the fact that war has been fundamentally transformed by these cheap and very effective drones. Trump ostensibly has been paying attention to the way the war in Ukraine is being fought, where drones have been arguably the most important aspect of that war, and yet somehow didn't make the connection that Iran has a massive supplies of these very cheap drones that can only be brought down by these extremely expensive American interceptors that we already had a limited supply of these. So all of this to say that I'm just surprised to learn that the White House seems to be surprised by all of these elements that were completely foreseeable, to say nothing of the fact that sort of the nature of the Iranian regime, that it was not going to be a government that you could simply take out by taking out the supreme leader. I mean, Iran arguably has been preparing for this since last summer, but also for a generation, just knowing what their position was, sort of the mindset of that government. They have been putting contingency plans into place for just this scenario, and now we can see that they were prepared in a way that Trump and the United States clearly were completely unprepared.
You mentioned the Gulf states being, annoyed that they've been put in this position. I'm still sort of unsure about where the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia stand, because the New York Times over the weekend had a report where they suggested that Trump is speaking all the time to Mohammed bin Salman, was the crown prince of Saudi Arabia, who is apparently telling him to keep hitting Iran hard. Obviously, it was the Gulf states Israel principally, but also the Gulf states who lobbied against Obama's nuclear deal. So is there an argument that actually this is, even if it's not good for them, it's what they asked for?
So I would be extremely skeptical of reporting from the New York Times, just given what we know about the makeup of their editorial board. And they're very pro-Israel bent. What I'm hearing from Saudi Arabia is that these are Israeli talking points to try to distribute the blame and to try to drag Saudi Arabia into the war, to get Iran to keep hitting them such that the Saudis subsequently must respond. Whereas they are really trying to stay out of it, to be, the Saudis, but all the Gulf states trying to make very clear that although they do have these US bases in their territory, that they're not allowing attacks to be launched from those bases, that they themselves are not using any of their own arsenals or weapons to fire at Iran, only trying to intercept incoming missiles and drones. You're certainly right that the Arab Gulf states and in particular the Saudis felt quite betrayed by the way that the Iran nuclear deal was negotiated. They felt excluded. They wanted to have been part of those negotiations, and they wanted it to address Iran's missile program. However, following the Iranian attacks on the Abqaiq oil facilities, in 2019, when Trump responded by saying essentially, well, they hit Saudi Arabia, they didn't hit the US, and really had almost no reaction at all. That was a huge shock to the Saudis. And it was not the first time that they felt disappointed by the Americans' apparent unwillingness to live up to what they thought they'd been paying for all these years. Hundreds of billions of dollars in US armaments, in fighter planes. I mean, they've invested massively in the US military industrial complex, as well as the US economy. And they expected more of a response for all of that, all those investments. And so as a result, instead, they concluded that they couldn't rely on the Americans. And they worked to reduce tensions with Iran, which resulted in them normalizing relations in early 2023 in a deal that was guaranteed by China. And when I was in Saudi Arabia in December and was speaking with officials about this, including with officials who are extremely skeptical of Iran, as you said. I mean, there's no love lost there. They are quite... there's a degree to which they would prefer to see a less powerful Iran, but they had come to the conclusion that they can't change their geography. Iran is not going anywhere, and they are better served by an Iran that is not aiming its weapons at them, that feels more secure. I mean, their sort of worst case scenario is where we are now, where we're in a war, and whatever comes out of it, whether it's a more the U.S. definitively loses, and the Iranian regime is left intact, but is now dead set on a nuclear weapon, is more paranoid. I mean, the supreme leaders, father, mother, wife, and child were all killed by Israel / the United States. By placing him in charge, someone who otherwise would not have been likely a contender for this role of supreme leader. But that is a big middle finger to the United States to say, look, we're putting another Imam, Ayatollah Khamenei, in. You managed to replace one Ayatollah with his son, who is more of a hardliner, as obviously a very personal animus towards the U.S. and Israel now. So on the one hand, it's either this angry, paranoid Iranian regime that the whole Gulf has to deal with, or it's absolute chaos. If the U.S. is successful in sort of dismantling the Iranian government and Iran falls into chaos, then you have drug smuggling, human trafficking, refugees coming across the Persian Gulf, which is not that big of a body of water, and the Gulf states are completely opposed to that. So all this to say, I think this reporting from the New York Times that the Saudis are pushing for this, I think is a narrative that's being pushed by Israel, and it's trying to drag the Arab states into the war because Israel is hoping that Iran will shift its focus away from them and aim its missiles and drones at the Gulf states, because Israel's purposes would be well served by these countries fighting each other. And if Israel could sort of take a back seat, because we know that Israel is also running very low on these interceptors. And it's unclear how much longer they're going to be able to sustain this fight.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, I suppose also because one thing I've been thinking about is that, if this war is seen as a disaster in America, which widely it does seem to be sort of being interpreted as, and it's so openly something that the Israelis sort of tricked Trump into, then that is going to be very unhelpful for Israel standing in the United States. So if they can share the blame and make it seem like, it was also the Saudis who wanted this to happen, don't blame us. That makes some sense. I want to talk about the Strait of Hormuz, of course. Donald Trump asking allies and also China to come and help clean up his mess. Most of them have indicated they don't want to get involved. But even if they did, is there say that Britain, China, all these countries did decide, okay, Trump created the mess, but we are all suffering, so we will all try and help clean this up. Is there a military solution? Is there a way, sort of short of a negotiated peace with Iran, that the Strait of Hormuz can be reopened?
I think the short answer is no, because, as you've indicated, we have many other countries that are not willing. At this point, the United States isn't willing to bring the U.S. Navy within range that could be struck by these Iranian drones and missiles. That would be a huge blow to America's image of, one, especially an aircraft carrier or something being taken down. And so no other country wants to be in that position either. I mean, these boats are extremely valuable. And the thought of losing one to help Trump, it's not as if Trump has conducted his foreign policy in a way that really any country feels particularly interested in making sacrifices on his part. So while it is accurate that a tanker alone is going to be more susceptible to being hit by a drone or missile than one that is accompanied by an armed ship that ostensibly could intercept that, it puts both ships would be extremely vulnerable still. I imagine people have seen some of those images of those very precise drones, like coming and taking out things like the massively expensive military radars in places like Bahrain. They're sort of slow moving. They're able to come in very precisely. The U.S. interceptors aren't necessarily built to. I mean, they can take out some of them, but also we're just running low on them. And so while it is possible, as you said, that some countries may simply feel forced to try to do what they can to try to get some fuel through, because the alternative is no fuel. I suspect that most countries are really not keen to try to do that, given that it has a low chance of real success.
Yeah, that's such a good point, actually, because there's all this argument about whether or not the Europeans will join the Americans in trying to keep the Strait open. But as you say, the Americans aren't actually doing anything to keep the Straits open because they don't want their military to be subjected to the Shahed drone. So in a way, all of this is a sort of red herring, isn't it? Whether other countries will join the Americans, because the Americans aren't even doing it. Let's talk about sort of the rockets, the drones. And lots of people are sort of talking about this as a war of attrition. Who can sort out their supply lines first? Sorry. I suppose, is it the case that Iran is getting lots of their Shahed drones from China? I've been seeing sort of videos on social media of Chinese factories where they're creating what look like Shahed drones to go to Iran. Could that be, a pressure point at some point, or a China? If these drones are coming from China, are they happy to keep the Americans bogged down in the Middle East?
I haven't seen those videos, I'm not a military specialist, so I shouldn't claim expertise that I don't possess. However, just the question about would China be happy to see the U.S. remain bogged down in the Middle East? I mean, absolutely. This is certainly in China's interest, and it does also get to, as you said, a red herring that you hear about a lot when there's been this discussion for years since Obama about the United States ought to pivot to Asia, that the Middle East is really no longer such a strategic region as it once was. Certainly oil is important, but most Middle Eastern oil does flow east to China and other countries in Asia. And the United States at this point remains the largest producer of petroleum in the world, although it is obviously the U.S. economy is still very dependent on fossil fuel, and a spike in oil prices affects everyone. It doesn't matter that the U.S. is the largest producer. But still, this particular Middle Eastern oil is no longer so crucial to the U.S. economy as it was during things like the Gulf oil crisis in the 1970s, for example. But so this idea that if the U.S. pivoted to Asia, there would be a vacuum in the Middle East that China could then rush in to fill, China's just not interested. China doesn't extend security guarantees to other countries' security guarantees. I mean, clearly these are not actually very, very robust guarantees. If it's the United States that's being the actor in the region that's actually the source of the most instability and insecurity. But all that to say that China is not interested to replicate the mistakes of the United States by trying to take over the U.S. role in the Middle East. There's been some talk of whether Russia would be interested in doing that. I think at this point, Russia really has very little spare capacity given the war in Ukraine. And even so, I don't think Russia either would be interested in sort of trying to replicate American folly in the Middle East. But so yes, all that to say, I think China is quite pleased to see the U.S. Once again bogged down in an unnecessary war of choice in the Middle East.
Do you think Donald Trump has already lost this war? Do you think America have already lost this war?
I mean, what I'm worried about is that you hear from Hegseth and others, and my understanding is that there's some discussion of the possibility that the United States might use a nuclear weapon on Iran. So in that scenario, that wouldn't be the United States winning. Obviously, if it got to that point, I think that would just be an indication of just how desperate the United States is and just willing to take on this doctrine of total destruction the way Israel has in Gaza and elsewhere now in Lebanon. So that would not be the United States winning, but it might be the U.S. sort of out of spite trying to destroy as much as it can to leave Iran in such ruin that it would be hard to argue that the Iranians won. So kind of there'd be no winners. I'm very worried, in addition, about the possibility of a U.S. ground invasion. I think that would be extremely foolish on Trump's part, would be extremely dangerous for those Americans as well as the Iranian civilians subjected to that level of violence. So has the U.S. already lost the war? I mean, I think that Trump is going. I think on the one hand, yes. On the other hand, I think it's Trump in this sense of like machismo bravado is going to perhaps try to just destroy as much as possible in order to make it clear that the Iranians also lost.
And I suppose what should the Iranians be doing? Obviously, I keep hearing that they don't want to sign any kind of negotiated peace, even if Trump wants it, which is obviously an open question. But even if he wants it, they won't sign it because they don't trust the Americans, because they've done these negotiations before and been bombed midway through negotiations. So they've got good reason not to trust the Americans. But I mean, I still struggle to see how the Iranians continuing to sort of attack ships in the Strait of Hormuz, sort of grinding the global economy to a bit of a halt, how while that, is it not almost cutting off your nose to spite your face? Because while that is inflicting harm on the Americans, I mean, is Iran being destroyed, or is Iran sort of holding up okay? I mean, what's your interpretation of that?
You're certainly not wrong, and in some ways, it's a little bit like Hamas's calculus in Gaza, that they are willing to have Gaza be destroyed, but be able to say at the end, "But we're still here." And so similarly, I think the Iranian calculus is, there were hardliners inside the Iranian government that were quite opposed to the ceasefire deal that Iran agreed to last summer. And now they've been vindicated, because here we are just half a year later and they're at war again, and it's much worse this time. And so those voices inside the Iranian government would have said we needed to hit Israel and I mean, they can't really hit the US, but we should have continued harder to make it clear, to sort of reestablish deterrence, that if you hit us, we will be able to hit you and really make it hurt. And so my understanding of what's going on right now is they need to get it through the Americans and the Israelis' skulls that don't do this again. We can inflict real pain on you, on your friends, on the global economy. And so, as you said, they may be somewhat cutting off their nose to spite their face, but it's in order to preserve the face, that they can kind of survive and try to ensure that this doesn't happen again. I think the concern here is that as long as Israel continues to face very few costs, I mean, there have been some costs. There have been, I believe, 13 is the latest count of Israelis who've been killed, or people inside Israel. I'm not sure of their citizenship. But Israel really has yet to pay a real cost for its aggression, whether against Iran, against Lebanon, against Qatar, against Syria. hitting ships in Tunisia. And the concern is also that Israel is then looking to Turkey as another militarily powerful actor in the region that Israel doesn't want to have, maintaining its sort of military power. And so I know Ankara is quite concerned that, kind of regardless of what ends up happening with Iran, that they're going to be in Israel's sights next. And similarly, you have some Saudis saying this too, that when you have an actor like Israel that has experienced so few costs for its extreme aggression, war crimes, genocide, etc., and that it sees any other militarily powerful country within its vicinity as a possible threat, that no one is safe. And so basically, if we want to stop this cycle of violence in the Middle East, Israel needs to be less powerful. The U.S. needs to stop sending these unconditional weapons and security assistance to Israel, to billions and billions of dollars every year. And Israel needs to understand that if they just behave like a normal country, the region would be a lot more secure and a lot more peaceful. But if they keep engaging in these acts of aggression, in addition to this insane idea of greater Israel, of further expanding their territory, they're only going to continue to reap retaliation, violence, and instability.
I suppose it seems like this war is not going to plan for Donald Trump, right? I mean, he said all the explanations he's had for it haven't come to pass. So he said, the Iranians, they should rise up after I kill their supreme leader, and that's how this will end, with regime change. Then he says, actually, I want to find a kind of Delcy-like character. Clearly, Delcy Rodriguez of Venezuela, that's not going to happen. He's really stabbing in the dark for a justification for going into war and then an idea of what success would look like. For Netanyahu, do you think everything's gone to plan? Is this what he was hoping for?
That's a great question. I think that from Netanyahu's perspective, he really doesn't care. Whether it's if he ever thought that it would have been possible to establish a Delcy Rodriguez-like figure, I imagine he was probably paying more attention to the dynamics inside the Iranian government and may have been better aware of the unlikelihood of that. I do think that he feels his interests are best served by this extreme violence, by the destruction of Iran. And in addition to that, by sort of this increasing sense among Israeli society that Israel really is under attack, that they have to continue to try to hit these other neighboring countries, as opposed to having a politician in Israel who would make the argument that, look, if we stopped attacking other countries, and you think back to just a few years ago, pre-October 7th, where you had this sort of Abraham Accords model, which again, I think helped contribute to October 7th. So not to say that that was a long-term path to stability, but there was kind of a perception, at least inside Israel and certainly inside the United States, that the issue of Palestinian self-determination was really no longer so salient for Arab publics, that there were countries in the Middle East that were willing to normalize, that they were on kind of a glide path to broader Israeli normalization, and that it was only a matter of time before Saudi Arabia normalized, and that would be, a massive tipping point, and that they could really sort of put the issue of Palestinian nationhood to bed, and the Middle East would be peaceful and stable from there on out, and that you had an Israeli public that was also sort of, had bought into that idea, and yet in what we have instead is. And just to be clear, I don't want to attribute everything to Netanyahu, because the Israeli public the vast majority have been fully in support of Israel's genocide in Gaza. They support attacking Iran. This is not, some people try to argue that it's really all Netanyahu's fault, and it is shocking, the radicalization of Israeli society and the violence that they actively celebrate, including things like the rape of detainees on camera. It is really disturbing what Israeli society believes is in their interest. But all that to say, so Netanyahu really benefits from this sense of, if most of Israeli society feels they are under threat, feels that there's no security for them unless Israel attacks first. This is kind of Netanyahu's MO. This also helps personally to keep him out of jail. There are these, they've kicked the can down the road so many times for his corruption and everything else he's justifiably accused of. And so he, kind of like Donald Trump, is really just trying to stay out of jail, avoid the legal ramifications of his criminal acts. And if he, whether his, I don't know exactly his long-term plan, but to maintain this sense of threat that helps to keep him in power.